Walk into an old English farmhouse while it is being gutted, and every so often you will catch a builder making the same discovery. They pry up a cold, cracked concrete floor poured in the 1960s, the kind that has been pulling damp into the walls and rotting the skirting boards for half a century. And sitting underneath it, they find another floor, far older. A hard, dry surface that has been in the dark, doing its job since before the building above it had its current name. The modern floor failed in 40 years. The one beneath it had already lasted 500, and it was made of dirt, lime and ash. We have been told that medieval floors were filthy, packed mud and rotting straw, crawling with fleas, a hazard our ancestors put up with because they knew no better. That picture is mostly wrong, and the people who laid those floors understood things about moisture, heat, and the chemistry of a living building that we spent the last 100 years forgetting. This is the story of what was really under their feet, how they built it, and why we tore it out for something worse. How does a floor made of dirt outlast the house standing on top of it? To get there, you have to throw out the picture in your head, because almost all of that picture comes from a single bad-tempered letter. In 1524, the Dutch scholar Erasmus wrote to a friend describing English floors. He said they were laid with clay and strewn with rushes so rarely cleaned that the bottom layer might sit undisturbed for 20 years, hiding spit, scraps of fish, grease, bones, and the leavings of dogs and men. That one passage is where almost the entire image of the disgusting medieval floor comes from. It is quoted everywhere. Read it again, though. Erasmus was describing neglect in crowded houses and inns, and he was writing after the medieval period had already ended, taking a swing at English habits for the entertainment of a friend. 20 years was the scandal he was reporting, not the standard. In a working monastery, the dormitory rushes were swept out and replaced once or twice a year, and in finer houses the loose rushes had already given way to woven matting, plaited and laid down like carpet. Some of it still survives in English country houses today. And underneath that covering was not raw dirt. It was a floor that somebody built. For most of the Middle Ages, the standard floor in ordinary European houses was earth, and it stayed in use in rural homes for centuries after that. But beaten earth is a misleading name, because the good version was never just soil walked on until it packed down. It was a recipe. Clay was the binder, the thing that held everything together as it dried. Sand and grit gave it strength under load. Chopped straw ran through it the way steel rebar runs through a modern slab, tying the whole thing together and stopping it from cracking as it shrank. Into the mix went wood ash and water, which reacted with the clay and bound it harder, closer to a soft natural cement than to mud. Then it had to be compacted, and this is the best detail in the whole story. You did not tamp a floor like this alone. You called the neighbours. As many people as the household could gather would come and tread the wet floor, back and forth, for an entire afternoon, sometimes longer, until the surface was flat, dense and smooth. Think about that for a second. The making of the floor was a social event, the way a barn raising was, and what you ended up with was not a thin skin of mud, but a bound surface several inches thick that behaved more like soft stone than soil. People had literally walked it into being. A bare earth floor still has one weakness. It dusts. Dry clay powders underfoot, which is why the good floors were sealed. The usual sealer was a drying oil, most often linseed, worked into the surface in coat after coat. Linseed does not just dry on top. It cures, the molecules cross-linking into a tough, water-resistant film bonded into the clay itself, and a floor finished this way could be waxed and polished to a hard, dark sheen that lasted for centuries. In some regions, builders reached for something stranger. They worked milk or blood into the surface. That sounds like superstition. It is chemistry. Milk carries casein and blood carries albumin, and both are proteins that set hard and turn water-resistant once they cure. Britain's building conservation literature records that medieval earth and lime floors were sometimes mixed with milk or blood to leave a partially waterproof skin that kept the damp down. Few of those floors survived to be studied, but the technique is real, and it was doing the same job a modern sealant does, with the only binders a farm could produce for free. That covering on top of the floor is worth stopping on because it hides the cleverest thing the medieval household did, and almost nobody mentions it. The rushes were not just for cushioning and warmth. People scattered specific plants through them, and the choice had nothing to do with making the room smell nice. Look at the names: fleabane, wormwood, pennyroyal, tansy. Every one of them contains compounds that repel or kill insects, and people knew it. In 1557, Thomas Tusser put it in plain verse, telling readers to save wormwood seed so that where the chamber is swept and the wormwood is strewn, no flea would dare show itself. Think about what that actually is. In an age with no insecticides, in homes that shared their space with livestock and had no way to seal away food, people were laying a renewable botanical pesticide across the floor of every room. Meadowsweet, the herb Queen Elizabeth reportedly wanted strewn in her chambers above all others, is loaded with salicylates, the same chemical family that gives us aspirin. This was a working pest control and sanitation layer, built straight into the floor, in a world that had no other version of it. The royal household accounts even show it running as a paid job, with men hired specifically to keep the king's chamber supplied with fresh rushes. In some English parishes, the cutting and laying of those rushes became a fixed event in the year, a communal harvest in late spring that survived as a festival called rush bearing, long after anyone could remember why the floors had ever needed it. That same practical, hands-on knowledge ran straight through the medieval kitchen, and we have put the cooking side of it into plain working guides at the Medieval Way store. A sourdough manual built on how they actually baked, a collection of refined period recipes, and a sourcing guide for tracking down the real ingredients. If you want to cook the way these people built, the link is in the description. Now, back to the floor, because the next problem these builders solved was the one directly over their heads. You cannot lay a beaten earth floor on an upper story. It is too heavy, and there is no ground beneath it to press against. The answer, in parts of England where lime was easy to come by, was one of the most overlooked building materials in the country's history. The lime ash floor. Lime ash was, in the most literal sense, garbage. It was the residue raked out of the bottom of a wood-fired lime kiln, leftover lime mixed with wood ash that would otherwise have been thrown out. Builders took that residue, combined it with sand and aggregate, often gypsum, sometimes even animal hair for strength, and spread it over a bed of reeds laid across the floor joists. As it set, it hardened into a solid, slightly springy slab so tough that today people regularly mistake it for concrete. A family could be walking across what was effectively a sheet of set lime suspended a full story in the air, with nothing under it but reeds and timber and total confidence in the mix. In hundreds of surviving buildings, it still holds. And these floors could be finished to a startling degree. At Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, one of the great houses of Elizabethan England, the top surface was buffed to a sheen with a mixture of egg white, curdled milk, and isinglass, a gelatin made from fish. A floor polished with egg, milk, and fish glue is not the work of people who did not care what they walked on. Now for the honest part, because your floor history has to survive a fact check, and this audience runs one. The lime ash floor is not mainly a medieval invention. These floors are well documented from the 16th century onward. Genuine 13th and 14th century examples are rare, and 15th century ones only a little less so. The technique grew out of the medieval world and then exploded in the centuries that followed. But it does reach back. Archaeologists excavating a medieval manor at Bingham in Nottinghamshire found a gypsum plaster and lime ash floor that ranks among the earliest of its kind recognised in England. And Cote Haley House in Cornwall, a mansion whose origins go back to around the year 1300, holds a lime ash floor laid in 1520 that is still in place. Most people have never heard that a floor can last 5 centuries and still be in service. These can. Some still are. We know all of this the way we know most things about ordinary medieval life. By digging. A floor is one of the most useful things an archaeologist can find because unlike a wall or a roof, it stays exactly where it was laid. A packed earth surface shows up as a hard, level band in the soil, often with a slot along one edge where a timber wall plate once sat and the objects trodden into it, a lost coin, a broken pot, a fishbone, date the surface and quietly describe the room that once stood above it. The Bingham floor was read this way, against the documents, which is how it earned its place as one of the earliest examples recognised in the country. By now you might notice these floors have almost nothing in common in their materials. Beaten clay, oiled earth, lime and kiln ash. But they share one property, and it is the single most important thing these builders understood and we forgot. Every one of them could breathe. A medieval house had nothing sealing it off from the earth, no concrete foundation, no damp-proof course, no sheet of plastic between the building and the ground. Moisture rose out of the soil, passed up through the porous floor, evaporated into the room, and left again through walls of lime mortar and stone that were just as permeable. The whole building handled water by letting it move through and escape, instead of trying to block it. The floor stayed sound because it was never asked to hold the water back. It was only ever asked to let it pass. That is the first of 3 jobs the floor was doing, and it is the one the modern building trade spent decades getting wrong. The second is heat. A few feet down, the ground holds a steady temperature all year, around 10 degrees Celsius in a climate like Britain's. A thick earth or lime floor sits in direct contact with that enormous stable mass, slow to warm and slow to cool, which flattens the temperature swings in the room above it. The floor does not feel warm the way a heater feels warm. It feels steady. It was a thermal flywheel, built into the ground, and it cost nothing to run. The third job belonged to the lime floors in particular. Fresh lime is a strong alkali with a very high pH, and very little can grow on a surface that hostile. While it was fresh, a lime floor actively resisted mould, bacteria, and the things that breed in a damp house, which is exactly why lime was slathered on cellar walls, dairy floors, and sick rooms for centuries. There is a limit to this, and you should know it, because someone in the comments will. The effect fades. As the lime reacts with the air, it slowly turns back into ordinary calcium carbonate. The pH drops, and the antimicrobial bite wears off. A fresh lime floor is a mild disinfectant. A 100-year-old one is just a very good floor. Put the 3 together, a surface that moved moisture out instead of trapping it, stored the day's heat and gave it back at night, and started out hostile to the things that make a house sick. That is a floor doing real work. A modern floor is asked to do one thing, hold still and look flat, and everything else is treated as someone else's department. The same invention that finally made floors cheap, fast, and identical everywhere was the thing that quietly broke them. Ordinary Portland cement existed in the 19th century, but it became cheap and widely available between the world wars, and it changed flooring for good. A poured cement slab is strong, level, and quick to lay. It is also, compared to everything before it, very nearly waterproof. It does not breathe. For a new building designed around it, that is fine. The trouble started when people took these sealed modern floors and dropped them into old buildings that were never built for them. An old house was a system that let moisture rise and evaporate, and the breathing floor was part of that system. Seal it under impermeable cement, and the water that used to leave through it does not stop arriving. It goes sideways instead, into the base of the walls, and it climbs. Damp that a building never suffered in 400 years can appear within a few of the improvement. The owner calls it rising damp, injects the walls with chemicals, and often pours more cement to fix it. The cottage gets written off as too old and too wet to save. The real culprit is a bag of cement and a roll of plastic. This is no longer a fringe view. Conservation and heritage bodies in Britain now warn against putting cement floors into traditional buildings, and the repair they recommend is to go backward, to lay a breathable lime or limecrete floor and let the building dry itself out the way it was meant to. We did not forget how to make these floors because they failed. We forgot because something faster came along, and the faster thing hid its cost for decades before the damp showed up in the wall. None of this knowledge is actually lost. It was written down, it has been studied, and it is being used again, and the method is simple enough to follow, even if doing it well takes practice. A traditional earth floor today follows the medieval logic almost exactly. You start with a stable, well-drained base. Over it goes a mix of clay, sand, and chopped straw, in proportions that resist cracking, troweled on and levelled in layers, each one left to dry. Then you seal the whole thing with a drying oil, linseed being the classic choice, coat after coat until the surface stops drinking it in, and a wax finish on top leaves a floor that is warm underfoot, good to look at, and repairable with a handful of the same mix. A lime floor asks for more respect. The material is caustic while it is fresh, the same property that makes it antimicrobial, so it has to be handled with proper protection. But the principle holds. It breathes, it manages moisture, and it ages into a hard polished surface instead of cracking and lifting the way a thin cement screed does. And if you live in an old house with damp creeping up the walls, this is not trivia. The most useful thing it tells you is to find out what your floors and walls are actually made of before you seal anything, because a breathing building wants breathing materials, and the wrong modern floor can cause the exact problem you are trying to cure. For most of human history, the floor was the most honest part of the house. It could not hide behind paint or plaster. It got walked on every day by everyone, and it had to earn that. People mixed clay and ash and lime and oil, called in the neighbours to tread it flat, polished it with egg and milk, and left surfaces that have outlasted the families who laid them and the kings who taxed them. The floor under your feet right now will almost certainly not be here in 500 years. Theirs still are. If this is the kind of buried knowledge you want more of, subscribe. Every week we dig up something the modern world walked away from, and we test whether the old way actually worked instead of just assuming it did. And tell me in the comments which forgotten building technique we should put under the microscope next. The floor was only the beginning of what got paved over.